Professor McCloskey, who I was initially slated to debate, despite 3 degrees from Harvard, could not defend transgender ideology. He knew my views, we had chatted about them, he repeatedly expressed his desire to debate, then at the last minute he withdrew because, I suspect, he felt it more prudent to concede than to lose in front of C-SPAN's cameras. Even a distinguished scholar could not defend the indefensible. My opponent tonight has a more middle-of-the-road position than Professor McCloskey. Unlike Professor McCloskey, Mr. Polumbo does not believe that so-called trans women are really women. He has admitted that they're men. He doesn't think we should trans the kids. He opposes men in women's sports. But he does address men who identify as women as she and her. And he does think they should be allowed into women's bathrooms. This middle-of-the-road position makes even less sense than Professor McCloskey's. At least McCloskey is consistent. He says transgenderism is true, and therefore true for everyone of all ages. And therefore, we ought to call some men she and her, and allow them into the girls' bathroom and onto women's sports teams, and give them all the rights and privileges that our culture and law traditionally reserve for women. My opponent tonight, on the other hand, is inconsistent, even, I'm sorry to say, incoherent on this point. He says transgenderism is not true, but that we ought to pretend that it is, but only sometimes. He has said that if Blair White, who's a very nice guy, by the way, who's been on my show, if he were convicted of a crime, that he ought to be sent to a women's prison because surgery and makeup have made him sufficiently dainty, whereas burlier transgender-identifying criminals might have to stick with the men. My opponent suggests that we be dishonest enough to call men she, but honest enough not to force women to compete against men in sports, but still dishonest enough to force women to share bathrooms with men. Because the men aren't women, but they should enjoy women's rights and privileges, but only some rights and privileges, and those based on, I don't know. I'm sure Brad will do his best to explain that in just a moment. Seems a bit haphazard to me. Above all, though, my opponent believes the law should pretty much stay out of it. It is this last point that matters for tonight's debate, because tonight's debate does not concern whether transgenderism is true or even how to address it. Tonight's debate concerns a more basic question. Should the law regulate transgenderism at all? On that question, there is not much to debate, because regardless of whether or not one wishes for the law to regulate transgenderism, it will. Even the most tolerant, open-minded, pluralistic society cannot simultaneously uphold mutually contradictory principles. In even the most liberal society, the law must answer at least certain basic questions. If the law has nothing to say about what a woman is, then the law has nothing to say at all. My opponent might suggest we leave it to private business to decide, but the practical implications of transgenderism extend far beyond private business, to the military, to public schools, to government employees, and to many other sectors of society. The law cannot evade the question. The bathroom issue keeps coming up because it is so clear and so instructive. It presents a conflict between two supposed rights, the right of women to have their own bathrooms and the supposed right of some men to go into the women's bathroom, thereby abolishing women's bathrooms. The law must pick a side. There is no neutrality. Unlike some other political issues, there can be no middle ground. Either women get their own bathrooms or they don't. Either women have rights and legal protections as women, as they always have, or they don't. The law might say they do, and the law might say they don't. But the one thing the law cannot say is nothing.